The unique and independent American woman, adventurer, pioneer, poet, mother, educator, artist, freedom fighter. A history of women's achievement in America is an incredible 400-year story of American women's inspiring accomplishments and victories. Destined to play an essential role in the shaping of the United States, American women forged an identity unlike any other in the world. That identity found a voice as they created great literature and science. American women led the fight to end slavery, limit corporate power, provide education for all, and to protect the poor, the disenfranchised, the immigrants, and the insane. At the same time, these unique American women would have to fight tirelessly for their own equality in politics, education, and the workplace, even the right to vote.
Hello, I'm Donna Mills, and welcome to the first episode of A History of Women's Achievement in America. When the first woman set foot on what would become American soil in 1608, it was the start of something very special. From the beginning, women were essential to the survival of the English colonies. Once here, they took on leadership roles and created a uniquely American female voice, one that the world had never heard before. Once here, they raised their families and helped to settle the ever westward-moving frontier. And when it came time to establish a new nation, the United States of America, women joined in the uprising, the protests, and then fought in the Revolution. The first 200 years of American history chronicles the emergence of the independent American woman. The first attempts by the English to establish colonies along the Atlantic seacoast failed. It's been said that if women had not participated in the colonization, all of the English colonies would have failed, and the United States of America would never have existed.
Without women like these, it is entirely possible, even likely, that the English colonies in North America would not have survived. And if the colonies had not survived, America as we know it today would not exist. Right from the beginning, women colonists participated in and shaped the creation of a new kind of nation. And in turn, that emerging nation, America, opened up a new kind of identity for women. That identity empowered American women to achieve more than history had ever seen before. By the middle of the 16th century, most of the European nations had set their sights on the New World. In North America, French missionaries and trappers went north to modern-day Canada. Spanish conquistadors went south to the gold mines of Mexico and South America, later working their way north into the desert Southwest and Florida. But England's explorers and adventurers looked to establish a place to live in the New World. Where they settled was a narrow strip of land along the Atlantic coast of North America. The first attempts to colonize by the English failed. Adventurers at Roanoke disappeared without a trace in 1587. In 1607, the English established a settlement on the Jamestown River in Virginia. The 100 men and 4 boys were nearly wiped out in the first 2 years. The settlement was a disaster. What was missing were women. In 1609, English women and families arrived on North American soil. Women established a sense of permanent settlement for the first time. Their survival, one of the greatest achievements by the colonists, meant the colony itself would survive. The fight for survival began the moment the first woman stepped aboard a ship like this one, bound for the New World. The journey across the North Atlantic was a horrible 3 months of choppy seas, short rations, and tight quarters. Merely surviving the journey was a feat in itself. When they arrived, they found a strange new land. There were no cities, no ports, no government, only an untamed wilderness of dense forest, rocky shores, and strange native peoples. In England, women did mainly housework and some gardening. But in America, women were expected to work alongside the men, clearing trees, sowing crops into the rocky soil, and living in rough-hewn homesteads. 13 years after the founding of Jamestown, another group of English colonists arrived 600 miles north at Massachusetts Bay. The Puritans, religious separatists protesting the Church of England, had decided to found a permanent settlement in the New World. They took their wives and children and set out from Plymouth, England on the Mayflower. In their first year, the Puritan women helped found the second family settlement in America. This colony would later be called Plymouth Plantation. They arrived in Plymouth Harbor, Massachusetts in 1620. The women and children remained on the Mayflower for 4 months while the men built Plymouth Plantation. But the harsh conditions on board took their toll, and only 5 women survived their first year. While the men struggled to farm and hunt in their new land, the women held the colony together by cooking the food, making clothing, and raising the colony's 22 children. During that first year, the Wampanoag Indians aided the settlers in their efforts to carve a home in their world. In the fall, the Puritans invited them to a feast to give thanks. The women took on the daunting task of cooking for over 100 guests. They turned meat on spits, cooked in pots over open fires, and prepared a bountiful feast of venison, turkey, corn, and squash that fed colonists and Indians alike for 3 days. In the years that followed, there would be no stopping the waves of immigration to the New World. The Plymouth Plantation's inclusion of women and children set the pattern for successful settlements, not only for the first 13 colonies, but for settling the nation, from Daniel Boone's Kentucky to the old Northwest territories that would become Ohio, Illinois, Michigan, Indiana, and Wisconsin, to the families crossing the Great Plains in covered wagons to California, Oregon, Washington, New Mexico, and Arizona, and finally, at the end of the century, to the Great Plains, where farm families converted the wild prairies to farms to feed a hungry nation. That ability to survive on the edge of the frontier, that started with those first women to arrive at Jamestown and Plymouth Plantation, formed the cornerstone of the fiercely independent American woman.
Once the colonies became firmly established, more and more women poured in from England. Many of these women were well educated. Released from the shackles of European mores and prejudices, they used their freedom to express themselves. Some, like Anne Hutchinson, became religious leaders, pushing toward the separation of church and state, eventually written into the United States Constitution. Others, like Anne Bradstreet and Phyllis Wheatley, a slave brought from Africa, laid the foundation for the American female voice. They did it by writing poetry.
But I will that you know that Christ is the head of every man, and the man is the woman's head, and God is Christ's head. For the man was not created for the woman's sake, but the woman for the man's sake.
At the start of the 17th century, the accepted social and religious belief throughout the world was that women were inferior to men. Puritan men and religious leaders deeply mistrusted women, considering them daughters of Eve, and therefore greedy for both power and sexual gratification. The Salem witchcraft trials began in 1692, when 2 young girls were accused of being bewitched. Hysteria quickly swept the colony. The colony's royal governor, William Phips, created a new court to hear the witchcraft cases. Over 100 people were accused of being witches or wizards. 20 of them were executed, and 4 more died in prison. 16 were women. Then, in a really odd twist of fate, the harshness of colonial life opened a door for women. If a male settler died, which happened frequently, his wife was allowed to manage his property and provide for their children's welfare. Out of necessity, they demonstrated that women could be independent and survive. Most of these unheralded female heroes of America's early colonies remain unknown. 2 women who took advantage of this newfound independence emerging in the Massachusetts Bay Colony were Anne Hutchinson and Anne Bradstreet. Anne Hutchinson was born in England in 1591. In 1612, she married William Hutchinson, and 22 years later, in 1634, she and her husband immigrated to New England. Anne was a brilliant thinker, learned in the Bible and theology. After arriving in the colony, she began holding prayer meetings in her home. Soon, hundreds of men and women attended these meetings. It was during these meetings that Hutchinson expressed her breakthrough in religious thinking. She denied that conformity with the religious laws was a sign of godliness and insisted that true godliness came from an inner experience of the Holy Spirit. But her own Puritan church leaders thought her ideas heretical. She was tried and banished from the community. In 1637, Hutchinson and about 60 followers went south into Rhode Island, which later became a center for religious tolerance in the colonies. Anne Hutchinson's courage helped open the door for later women to embrace an American independence spirit. One of these women was Anne Bradstreet. Like Anne Hutchinson, Bradstreet was born in England. Well-read and educated, she arrived at Massachusetts Bay Colony in 1630 as an 18-year-old newlywed. Anne discovered life in New England was simple and rewarding. Soon she began writing poetry that reflected the change in colonial women as they began to embrace their destiny to become new, independent American women. This change was expressed in her poem on Queen Elizabeth.
Now say, have women worth, or have they none? Or had they some, but with our queen, is it gone? Nay, masculines, you have taxed us long, but she, though dead, will vindicate our wrong. Let such as say our sex is void of reason know 'tis a slander now, but once was treason. Anne Bradstreet.
When her first volume of poetry, The 10th Muse Lately Sprung Up in America by a Gentlewoman of Those Parts, was published in London in 1650, Bradstreet became America's first poet. Anne Bradstreet died in 1672 in Andover, Massachusetts.
One of her poems, or one of the stanzas of the prologue, really captures it. She says, "I am obnoxious to each carping tongue who says my hand a needle better fits. A poet's pen all scorn I should thus wrong. For such despite they cast on women's wits. If what I do prove well, it won't advance. They'll say it's stolen, or else it was by chance." She's saying to her readers, very carefully in that poem, that if her poetry is good, those who read it will say, how could a woman have done this? And several men in her community wrote testimonials that this was actually her poetry. They'll say it's stolen, or else it was an accident, it was by chance. And Bradstreet was to prove them wrong. The first edition came out in 1650, In 1678, 6 years after her death, the second edition came out with substantially new material, much of it her best work, personal poetry of her experience as a mother, as a woman in the colonies, as a woman who faced a frontier environment and settled herself in it. She gives voice to a woman's experience from the very beginning of white women's settlement in North America.
In the 21st century, America is celebrated for the quality and diversity of its literature. Yet, who would have thought that the American poetic voice embodied in authors such as Edgar Allan Poe, Emily Dickinson, and Gwendolyn Brooks found its origins in a person who was bought and sold, a black woman, living as a slave in Boston, Massachusetts. That woman, made free by the power of her poetry, was Phyllis Wheatley. In 1619, a Dutch ship brought the first black slaves to England's colonies. Over the next 150 years, slavery became embedded in the American culture. During this time, every colony enacted slave codes, making black men and women property. Even those blacks who were not slaves did not have the same rights as whites. They could not vote and were excluded from public schools. Even worse, black women slaves frequently had their children taken from them and were raped by their white masters. These were the conditions that existed in Phyllis Wheatley's America. Phyllis Wheatley's journey to fame as a foremother in American literature began here, in the bowels of a ship designed for the importation of black slaves. Kidnapped from her native Senegal in West Africa at the age of 7, she endured the infamous Middle Passage route to Bermuda and eventually ended up in Boston. There, ragged, ignorant, and exhausted, she was sold at a slave auction to the family of a tailor, John Wheatley. But the Wheatleys were not typical slave owners. Inspired by the teachings of evangelist George Whitefield, who preached equality among the races, the Wheatleys raised Phyllis not only as a servant, but as part of the family. Their faith was not misplaced. Phyllis, who possessed a profound intellect, took advantage of this opportunity. 4 years after she arrived in Boston, she had already mastered English and was reading the classics in Greek and Latin. At 13, inspired by the British poet Alexander Pope, she wrote her first poems. In her poem, On Being Brought from Africa to America, she wrote of her personal experience of enslavement and her religious beliefs that freed her.
'Twas mercy that brought me from my pagan land and taught my benighted soul to understand that there is a God and a Savior too. Once I redemption never sought nor knew. Some view our sable race with scornful eye, their color a diabolic dye. But remember, Christians, that Negroes black as Cain may be refined and join the angelic train. On Being Brought from Africa to America by Phyllis Wheatley.
Through her slim volume of poems, titled Poems on Various Subjects, Religious and Moral, Phyllis Wheatley founded 3 distinct intellectual movements: the American poetic tradition, the Black literary tradition, and the women's literary tradition, all in her second language, English. Because of her intellectual achievements, Wheatley was granted her freedom in 1774. She married another free black, John Peters, and continued to write until her untimely death at age 31 in 1784.
When the time came to create a new nation, American women were patriots in every sense of the word. They risked their lives in secret meetings, fomenting revolution, and then risked their lives once again on the battlefield. Though women were patriots, they couldn't become government leaders in the country they helped found. No one saw that injustice more clearly than Abigail Adams.
In 1766, when Samuel Adams called a meeting at this Boston tavern to launch the American Revolution, the Sons of Liberty were not the only ones that came. Women were right there from the beginning, and some would take on roles equal to those of the Founding Fathers. After the French and Indian Wars ended in 1763, the stationing of British troops in the colonies led to protests, which led to the Boston Massacre in 1770, the Boston Tea Party in 1773, and eventually to the battles of Lexington and Concord in 1775, and the signing of the Declaration of Independence in 1776. The Declaration of Independence was co-written by one of America's most famous revolutionaries, John Adams, and beside him, helping him in every step he took, was his wife, Abigail. She would become America's second First Lady and the mother to America's fourth president, John Quincy Adams. Abigail Adams was one half of America's first power couple and a standard bearer for women's rights. Her observations on American politics, as well as philosophical and personal subjects, were often ahead of her time. When Ben Franklin, John Adams, and Thomas Jefferson were drafting the Declaration of Independence in May of 1776, Abigail wrote John Adams to argue the importance of women's independence.
I cannot say that you are very generous to the ladies, for whilst proclaiming peace and goodwill to men, emancipating all nations, you insist upon retaining absolute power over wives. But you must remember that arbitrary power is like most other things which are very hard, very liable to be broken. Abigail Adams.
Then, Abigail Adams prophesied what would eventually take place, that women would accomplish what these learned men were afraid to do.
And notwithstanding all your wise laws and maxims, we have it in our power not only to free ourselves, but to subdue our masters, and without violence throw both your natural and legal authority at our feet.
Abigail continued to exert her influence on American politics through her husband. She fought for equal education for girls, accomplished by Mary Lyon, and she called for an end to slavery, accomplished by the many women abolitionists. Her letters and her achievement as one of America's most powerful women would inspire women of future generations, such as Edith Wilson, Eleanor Roosevelt, and Hillary Clinton. While Abigail Adams was helping to shape the ideals of America's freedom, other women were in the trenches fighting for it. For example, Mary Ludwig Hayes, otherwise known as Molly Pitcher, saved the day at the Battle of Monmouth, New Jersey on June 28, 1778. When American soldiers were dropping from heat stroke, Mary relieved the men with pitchers of water from a nearby spring. Then, after her husband fell wounded, Mary took his place at the cannon, firing shell after shell and forcing the British to withdraw. For her heroic role, General Washington gave her a battlefield rank as a non-commissioned officer, and thereafter she was known as Sergeant Molly. In 1778, Deborah Sampson of Plymouth, Massachusetts, disguised herself as a young man, and enlisting under the name Robert Shirtliff, she served for 3 years and was wounded twice. After the war, she received a soldier's pension of 34 pounds sterling. From the Daughters of Liberty, who toiled in support of the colonial protests, to Abigail Adams, who helped shape the institutions of liberty, to the women who fought for that liberty. American women were patriots in every sense of the word. Later, they would write their own piece of the Constitution, the 19th Amendment, the right for women to vote. Reach for the highest office when Geraldine Ferraro ran for vice president, and in the 21st century, fight side by side with men in Iraq and Afghanistan.
The story of Pocahontas and the role she played in the survival of the Jamestown colony is legendary. Pocahontas symbolizes the millions of Native American women who already lived in what would become the United States. The voices of most have been lost in the winds of history, but one whose exploits have become part of the American mythos is Sacagawea.
Little is known about the Native American women who lived in North America at the time of the Europeans' arrival. Their voices have been lost to the winds of history. What we do know about them lives on through their elegant and artistic expression in pottery, beadwork, and weaving. But while the collective Native American women's voices have been lost, one woman's courage and intelligence stands out in American history. She was Sacagawea, and her navigational and language skills helped ensure the success of the Lewis and Clark Corps of Discovery expedition to the Pacific Ocean and back. Sacagawea, a Shoshone Indian, was born around 1790. At age 10, she was kidnapped by the Hidatsa tribe. Her life might have lived out like hundreds of captives, but she married Toussaint Charbonneau, a French-Canadian trapper. In the spring of 1804, Lewis and Clark set out from St. Louis, Missouri, with a mandate from President Jefferson to explore the land acquired in the Louisiana Purchase. 7 months later, they arrived at a Mandan village on the Upper Missouri River in North Dakota, where they spent the winter. There, Lewis and Clark hired Charbonneau as an interpreter. They also asked that Sacagawea, who had given birth to a boy, Jean-Baptiste, christened Pompeii by the explorers, accompany them as the only woman in the expedition. Clark noted in his journal, "A woman with a party of men is a token of peace." On May 14, 1805, the boat Sacagawea was in nearly capsized, and many of the expedition's valuable instruments, books, and specimens were thrown out. Sacagawea calmly rescued them, even though she had Pompeii strapped to her back. Later, she guided the Corps to the Shoshone and interpreted negotiations for horses the expedition desperately needed to cross the Rocky Mountains. Sacagawea accompanied Lewis and Clark on their perilous journey to the Pacific Ocean and returned with them, living once more among the Mandan. Little is known of her life after that, but perhaps Sacagawea's most lasting contribution to the Corps of Discovery was her knowledge of indigenous medicinal plants and animals that Lewis and Clark brought back to President Thomas Jefferson. Although Sacagawea is the best known of the Indian women who took part in the opening of the American West, she was not the only one. Legendary explorers such as Kit Carson and James Beckwourth relied on their Native American wives to explore the nation's new lands. In addition, Yellow Woman, the Cheyenne wife of the trader William Bent, helped make Bent's Fort into the premier trading post on the Santa Fe Trail. Throughout the latter part of the 19th century and the first part of the 20th century, Native American women struggled to maintain their cultures on the isolated and poor Indian reservations. Then, in the last part of the 20th century, their voices were once more heard as artists, writers, and politicians, such as Wilma Mankiller, leader of the Cherokee Nation, and Cecilia Firethunder, who was elected president of the Oglala Sioux.
Entering the 19th century, the new nation was on firm ground. Denied equality by prejudice and the United States Constitution, we shall see in the second episode of A History of Women's Achievement in America how women swung open the door of achievement while at the same time began the slow march to true freedom. Thanks for watching. I'm Donna Mills.